I would like to travel through time with you for this next lecture. And I'm going to start, maybe a little bit surprisingly, with some general philosophical thinking. Then I continue to history, because I think it's really important to understand history, because history is what shapes the present, and you have to know about the things that shape this present. As we talked about yesterday, I think these long-term ideas that are in people's heads are actually very prevalent still nowadays. So if you want to understand how people came to think in a certain way, how people came to feel in a certain way, you have to look back into history. And in the third part, I would like to present you with my ideal of the European Union, because unfortunately, I'm not going to praise the European Union at the current state, which some people might have expected, especially I think Trevor, who's not here now because probably he expected that. But no, I'm not making the case that this European Union as we have it nowadays is the dream of any classical liberal, but I think that the framework can supply us with enough opportunities to transform this union into something even more appealing to liberals. Now let me start with a quote of, surprisingly, Friedrich August von Hayek, who in 1939, 80 years ago, we something to celebrate, right? We're always celebrating things that happened like 30 years, 80 years ago. So 50 years before the fall of the Iron Curtain, Hayek wrote this article, The Economic Conditions of Interstate Federalism. And it's interesting that obviously he already concerned himself with these kind of questions. And I quote, "Is it too much to hope for a rebirth of real liberalism?" 1939, you know, the Nazis in Germany, the Soviets in Russia, it's like the whole world is on fire. Is it too much to hope for a rebirth of real liberalism, true to its ideal of freedom and internationalism, and return from its temporary aberrations into the nationalist and the socialist camps? The idea of interstate federation as the consistent development of the liberal point of view should be able to provide a new point d'appui for all those liberals who have despaired of and deserted their creed during the periods of wandering. So the idea of interstate federation as the consistent development of the liberal point. I think generally speaking, Hayek would be in favor of such organizations as the European Union, if you listen to his words here. Maybe not of the one existing right now, but generally speaking, the concept of having more and more relations between the states, trying to mingle everything, would be, I think, in his understanding, something to work for. But now let's start with a brief perspective into philosophy. On this slide, you can see pictures of several Enlightenment philosophers. On the left-hand side, you can see those who you would label the continental Enlightenment. Probably know most of them, Descartes, Hobbes, Voltaire, Rousseau. They are very well known. They are the face of Enlightenment. On the right-hand side is a bunch of people, thinkers, that are not as well known, but have provided a very different strain of Enlightenment thinking, which for liberalism at least is much more important. It's the Scottish Enlightenment, and in the corner of the lower right, you can see Adam Smith, everybody knows. Next to him is Adam Ferguson, whom I mentioned yesterday already, an important social thinker. And on top you have the guy with a great hat. It's a beautiful hat. I really hope that those kind of hats are fashionable one day again. And next to it is John Locke. So I think these two Enlightenments are really, really diverse and different from each other. And they form a lot of the understanding we have nowadays of philosophy and politics, and which also is a difference between the way most people on the continent would approach questions opposed to people from the rather Anglo-Saxon mindset. Now, what I would criticize at the left side, at the continental philosophy, the continental enlightenment, is that they have a tendency to overestimate reason. They were the big thinkers of reason. For them, enlightenment meant to free the spirit, to free the mind of people from any ties they would have to, I don't know, religion or whatever old hierarchy, and set them free and finally make reason great again, or make reason finally great. And they assume that mankind's mind, mankind's reason is extremely powerful. Let me give you 2 examples out of these 4. Thomas Hobbes, who indeed isn't even French or continental, is English, but still is closer to this tradition. He thought that we have basically a huge problem because man is to man as a wolf, as he said, and that people are basically prone to chaos, and that's why you have to regulate things. That's why you need Leviathan, the big overarching system, which keeps us from hitting each other over the head. And in this understanding, I think he overestimated the individual reason. So he thought that a planner or a regent, somebody in charge of this Leviathan, is able, by his reason, by his insight, to manage such a thing as a human society, as a state. But what he underestimates, while he overestimates reason, the individual reason, is he underestimates civilization. And he underestimates all the institutions, the rules, the informal and formal rules that mankind has developed in order to prevent us from hitting each other over the head. And a similar, yet quite different approach has been found by Rousseau. He also overestimates reason, but not the individual reason of the one regent, the one planner, but instead the reason of the masses, the collective reason. La volonté générale, that's his big ideal, that if all people come together and form their reason to be one mind, then this will be the one right decision. It's, of course, one of the fundaments of democracy, as we often talk about today, that the majority actually finds the right thing. That's what Rousseau thought. And he also underestimates civilization, but from a different point of view. He had this idea that civilization would be something we have to overcome, because in the natural state, our reason is at its best, and civilization is sort of corrupting the reason which we naturally, by nature, have, and which could help us find the right way. So this continental enlightenment has a lot of optimism of reason, but they don't trust so much into man's ability to develop, to change, to adapt. And all those guys on the right side, they go back, of course, they didn't think of it all by themselves, they go back into the history of philosophy, they relate to some prior thinkers. And I would put them in one tradition, in one philosophical tradition, with Plato. Most of you probably have a certain extent of knowledge about Plato, and Plato had this idea that this theory of forms, you know, the story with the cave where people just see the shadows and then they eventually manage to get out of there and to see things as they really are. It's a process of utilizing, training your reason. So Plato basically had this idea that there exists the one ideal, which if you train your reason properly, you can eventually acknowledge, you can see. And from this, coming from this approach to epistemology, he also shaped his political theory. And one of the core points of Plato's political theory is that you need the philosopher king. In order to properly organize a society, a state, you need the really, really smart people to take care of things. And the other part of Enlightenment, the Scottish one, they are much closer to the tradition that Plato's scholars, Plato's successor also, Aristotle, formed, who in his epistemology was not so much convinced that there was the one idea which man was called to look into and to acknowledge, but he came from a more empiricist point of view. So he said, well, it's not about just finding the one true final thing, but it's about seeing the world around us, observing, learning by making observations. New insight is not formed by me seeing something completely abstract, but by me dealing with the world, being inside the world and understanding how things work. And from this point of view, he also had a completely different political concept from Plato. He saw mankind as, or the human being as the zoon politikon, as he put it in Greek. And zoon politikon doesn't mean, as some people might assume, that man is a political being who is just called to be member of a party and participate in politics. No, no, no. Politikon in the context of the Greek, ancient Greek, meant that you are in a polis, that you are a member of a community like Athens, for example, Corinth, or Thebes, or whatever city you might think of in Greece, that you are part of the city and that you are involved in the city business, so to speak. I mean, that might imply some political decisions, but it mainly implies that you are communicating, you are cooperating with the people around yourself. And that's what shapes the Scottish Enlightenment, and that's the tradition they stand in, that they think of man as a being among other beings, as a cooperative being. So Hume, for example, is convinced that man, or one of his major claims is man is not only guided by reason. Hume knows that we are guided a lot by emotions and that they play a major role in the way we approach the world. Ferguson, as I said yesterday, is a sociologist. He concerns himself with the man as a social being. He's really interested in how we work, how institutions are formed, how rules come up to be. It's not about designing the perfect world like the French Enlightenment often would have wanted, and how it ended in the French Revolution, where actually they tried to form a new man. But he was interested in observing, looking into how man actually works. And finally, of course, Adam Smith, with his concept of the spontaneous order, he also wasn't interested in finding the one right order, but he said, like, look into how things work out, and they work spontaneously. It's not something you can actually pave a way through, but it works by many people coming together and cooperating. So the guys on the right-hand side, they acknowledge the limits of human reason much more than the French continental Enlightenment. They know that our reason isn't as magnificent and marvelous as some of their colleagues on the continent would have thought. But at the same time, they are huge friends of the civilization, of the ability of mankind to develop, to cooperate, to adapt, to learn. So that's what for them is the driving force. Not that we are smart from the beginning, but that we can learn, that we can adapt, that we can improve ourselves gradually. And coming from these two concepts, I have two pictures which just stand for, I think, an opposition you can find in not only in Enlightenment philosophy, but in many ways of understanding the world, understanding politics, and so on, which I would like to present you with. And those are relevant then for the cause I'm making for a classical liberal European Union. The one concept I call the concept of sovereignty, and the other concept I call the concept of cooperation. Now, let me just give you some examples of how these two different concepts perceive things. As for societies, the people on the sovereignty side think that in a society you have individuals or collectives who are in charge. They are in charge of taking care of the society. May this be the ruler, the planner, the regent of Hobbes, or may it be the volonté générale of Rousseau. And this collective or this individual thinks about the right solution. What is right for society? On the other side, you have the cooperation side. You can see some merchants over there. That's the way how society is formed in this understanding. It's not about the one person who is completely enlightened, but it's about people talking to each other, trying to find solutions. And on the cooperation side, the individuals in a society, they cooperate and they experiment. And they don't want to find the right solution, but they want to find a functioning solution, one that works, one that actually solves a problem, not one that is thought of to be the ideal, the right one, but one that improves their lives, where they can trade in a better way, for example. Let's go into the realm of the state and the economy. In the sovereign mindset or sovereignty mindset, you need planning by competent people. Because, and not only you need planning, but you can actually have planning by competent people, because reason is considered to be very powerful. So if you have those people who are smart enough, they should take care of things. And you have sort of hierarchies. And hierarchy in Greek means holy order. So you have hierarchies which are set not by, it's not an order that has evolved spontaneously, but because it's holy. Because it's holy doesn't mean have to be religiously holy, but for example, the fact that you are endowed with reason, that you are a really smart person, that makes you part of this hierarchy, which enforces the plans and which attributes to people the different competences they might have in the state and the economy. In the cooperation model, to quote Adam Ferguson, which I already did yesterday, maybe you might remember, institutions are the result of human action, not of human design. So it's not about some holy order, it's not about somebody in charge, it's about people dealing with each other, and the state, the economy, the institutions, the rules, they come through human action because people do things that work, do things that help them gain a certain or achieve a certain goal. Now, how about the objectives of organizations in these two different concepts? In the sovereignty concept, the objective of an organization is to enforce the right way. So if you have any organization, institution, whatever, their main task is to enforce the right way. They are sort of offensive. They are actually acting. Institutions are there to better people, to find the right way. In the cooperation model, the objective of an organization is to prevent or avoid harm. So it's not about finding the one right way, but it's rather about preventing bad things from happening. Karl Popper once said, the main feature of democracy is not that you put people in power, but that it's a tool to get rid of people in power easily and without blood. So the cooperation model actually wants to prevent more. It's a defensive model. The organization, the institution, the rules are there to defend the freedom instead of enforcing something that is supposedly right. And finally, the two concepts of revolution and evolution can be tied to these different mindsets. The sovereignty model has a claim of truth. They claim that there is the one way how society, the state should be organized. And this claim of truth leads to the claim of power. Because if you know the right thing, then you ought to be somebody who, or you ought to be able to enforce this right thing. And everybody who's against that right thing is legitimately put down. So legitimately, you are entitled to start a revolution from upside and from downside. So it's not something, a revolution doesn't have to be something that comes up, bottom up. It can also be enforced from above. And you may change things really rapidly because you are endowed with the wisdom to find the right way. On the other side, the cooperation side, they don't claim to know the truth. They don't assume that there is one person or one collective that would know what is right. But they try to find something that is working. They try to evolve systems that are better and are optimized, but they don't want the one right truth. So every claim of power is questioned in the system, because every claim of power prevents people from experimenting, prevents people from trying new ideas, from searching for new ways of cooperating. And by hindering cooperation and competition, beneficial competition, power is something really problematic. So in the cooperation concept, you rather think of evolution as the way of changing things, which doesn't use power, but uses conviction, uses arguments, uses trial and error. And it's nearly an anarchic concept because it's anti-power, and anarchy is like the absence of power. So you have these two concepts, at least if you follow me, of understanding the organization of human community. Nobody has put that so beautifully as Friedrich August von Hayek, of course, in his article Individualism, True and False from 1945, one of his most wonderful articles. I can highly recommend reading it. It's just 20 pages. It's easy to read if you like Hayek's way of writing, which is complicated in German. And there he writes, human reason does not exist in the singular, as given or available to any particular person, as the rationalist approach seems to assume, but must be perceived as an interpersonal process in which anyone's contribution is tested and corrected by others. So that is basically the essence, I think, of the Scottish Enlightenment way of thinking of the cooperation model, that there is never one person who is smart, but intelligence and reason is not singular, it's plural. It comes from us always communicating, exchanging thoughts, exchanging ways of problem solving. That's how human reason works. It's something that comes to cooperation, not by individual intelligence. Now, that was enough of philosophy for now. Let's jump into history. This is a map of Europe in the 14th century. And it beautifully shows that Europe has an old tradition as sort of a patchwork continent. That is very typical for Europe. And even this map is a little bit confusing because, for example, in the Roman Empire, which is mainly based in Germany, you had much more small units, that sovereign units inside the empire than you can see on this picture. But basically, that's how Europe mostly looked like, and still now it's quite spread up into many smaller units. And I think that is an extremely important feature of the European model of success, this splitting up of small units. And it's what differs fundamentally, for example, from the Chinese concept. If you look into the East, not only now, but also like 2,000 years ago, they always had much more centralization, less small units, less federation. And I've once did some research on the traditions of federation in the European history. Wrote an extended paper on that. I'm not going to present you with all the paper, but just with some findings, because I think they are really interesting if we think about the role, the opportunities of the European Union nowadays. Let me start back in the day. This is really early European history. This is a painting from an Etruscan grave. So the Etruscans, as you probably know, were the guys who hung around Italy before the Romans came and smashed them. And the Etruscans actually had already an early model of federation. The Etruscans had 12 major cities in the center of what now we know as Italy. And these 12 cities, they shared language, they shared some certain cultural features, and they formed a federation. But this federation was a very loose federation. So it was mainly held together by a religious center. And this religious center was the element which secured peace. So if you would go to war with one of the other cities, this would inflict like your religious well-being. This would be something contrary to the gods. So the religious center was sort of the peacekeeping factor inside this federation of the 12 cities. And that's actually something we can find also nowadays, or maybe even a couple of hundred years ago, in the tradition of thinking about what Europe should be and what Europe should do. And already in the humanist times, like 14th, 15th century, you have first thinkers who think of Europe as being united in order to keep peace. So the main goal in those writings was to finally secure peace in Europe, and that's why people should come together and overcome their differences. Now, a big step forward in history. Here we can see something that is really, I think, an amazing part of European history. It's a map of the Hanseatic League. This was a huge federation of towns in the mainly, 13th to 15th century in Northern Europe, all around the Baltics and the North Sea. And you can see it goes from like down there in Belgium, what is now Belgium, up to Estonia and Norway, and also Britain was partially involved. So you have this huge area. And if we look into those days, 12th, 13th century, Europe was experiencing a growth of cities. Before that, the decisive powers in Europe were those who had big lands, at least since the end of the Roman Empire. The dukes, the counts, whatever, the leaders who had vast amount of land and maybe vast amount of soldiers. They were the ones determining the fate in Europe. That changed with the rise of the cities, because those cities, they managed to accumulate huge amounts of wealth through trade, through the opportunity of specialization. So if you have those areas where a lot of people live together, it's much easier to specialize. You can easily find like things that everybody can do for themselves because they're really good at that. And you have those, so to speak, bourgeois societies. So I mentioned yesterday the great economist Deirdre McCloskey, who wrote a couple of books, especially on those bourgeois societies and how they influenced the rise of liberalism. And that is especially by this bourgeois self-consciousness, that the people who take care of their own fate, the people who earn their own money, that these people gradually developed the ideas so fundamental for our liberal democracies nowadays. And these cities, they were not strong to military power. Of course, they didn't have like huge, vast amount of soldiers. They could just summon up and go send them away to hit the neighbor on the head. And that was one of the reasons why they said, well, we have to cooperate better, because no one city of us can withstand like the King of Denmark, for example. And actually, they once fought a very big war against the King of Denmark, because the King of Denmark was trying to get a hold of their riches, and they really hit him bad and had a quite impressive victory by actually uniting their forces. But not only this sort of defensive treaty was a reason for them to unite. I might say it's a very, very early form of the NATO, but also economic reasons. So trade was made easier if you had, for example, some standards. They could say, well, from Novgorod up to Ghent, all people would use some certain measurements that were the same. You had also a protection of the trade routes. You had a lot of benefits through this cooperating in economic questions too. So apart from the defensive aspect, also the facilitation of trade was one main reason for them to come together and for new cities to join this Hanseatic League, because it was very attractive. Now, just one side comment, which I think is really interesting if we talk about how the European Union might evolve and might be improved. These towns and cities, they had to take some decisions from time to time. They had to decide on certain issues. And sometimes it was just a proposition by one of the member cities to implement a certain policy across the cities. Now, how did they organize in order to take those decisions? So they had some general diets, which occasionally took place in various cities, where all the cities sent some representatives to participate. And at these diets, you had the so-called consensus principle, which meant that a notion was accepted if nobody objected to the notion. So it has to be unanimously, like at least not objected to the notion. Now, you had to, in order to find a motion where nobody would object to, of course, you had to do a lot of persuading, you had to find a lot of compromises, until you reached the point where nobody would say, no, I'm not going to accept this kind of motion, this kind of policy. And now comes the second step. So you sort of unanimously had to find a solution, and then the people went back to their towns, and they had this resolution, this policy, whatever, and they presented it to their town councils or their city councils. And since these motions were found unanimously, but they were not binding from the beginning, also the city councils had to accept the motions. So they had like a two-way consensus project there. You know, you had to find a consensus on the general level, but then you also had to find a consensus in your own city and town. And that, of course, affected the way that the compromises were looked for, were searched for. So you would find common objectives that were beneficial for many or the most, and that did not hurt anybody. Yet, you did not infringe the sovereignty of the respective city council. I think that's a very nice way of trying to find beneficial policies without actually making them compulsive from the beginning. Now, the third example I would like to present you with is this. It's one of the least known beautiful stories of liberalism in European history. Nearly nobody knows about this, but it's a shining example of early liberalism. This is the charter which was drawn up for the union of Poland and Lithuania in 1569. And the state that was formed by this union of Poland and Lithuania, which was quite an extensive state, it reached from the Baltic Sea nearly down to the Black Sea, was an amazing state. They called it the Polish Republic, PolishLithuanian Republic, and they rightly did so. They had an elective monarchy, so the king wasn't, you didn't become king because your dad was or your mom was queen or king, but you actually had to be elected. And now if you look into the electorate, the people who were to vote for the king, that included all of the Polish nobility. Now, if you know Poland, you know that nobility in Poland is quite well spread. It's not like in many other European countries where it's just a tiny group of people, but actually in Poland about 10% of the population were part of the nobility in those days. So in this state, 1569, 10% of the people were eligible to vote, of the male people, of course. The same amount of people were eligible to vote in the United Kingdom in 1838. So 250 years before the motherland of democracy, Britain, allowed 10% of its people to vote, that was already possible for people in Poland and Lithuania. Amazing fact that nobody is aware of, or nearly nobody. And this elective monarchy was also constitutionally beautifully designed, because the monarch actually was just sort of an instrument for the parliament, the nobility's parliament, the same, because the same could or had the right to decide about legislation, about taxation, about fiscal policy, and about foreign policy. So basically the king was very much tied up in the control of this early parliament. Also, a very important aspect was that this federation of Poland and Lithuania was hugely multicultural. I think about 14 different languages or peoples were living under this republic. Like, of course, Polish and Lithuanian people, but also people from Estonia, Georgians, Armenians, Greek, Ukrainians, Jews, and it's just a huge bunch of different peoples living under this republic. And also, Poland, Lithuania in those days was a haven, a safe haven of tolerance. So you had a lot of religious persecution going on in those times, like 16th, 17th century. Catholics persecuted Protestants, Protestants Catholics, Protestants Protestants. And basically everybody was persecuting everybody. And there was one country in all of Europe where anybody could go and was safe from persecution. That was Poland, Lithuania. So a lot of the Protestant sects, for example, like the small Protestant special groups whom everybody persecuted, they found a home in Poland, Lithuania. It's quite amazing, the history of the state. And this also was a federation, and some major features of this federation were the balance of power, the big influence of the parliament, and of course this atmosphere of toleration, of multiculturalism, of like getting along with each other in all the big diversity. Now, some of the findings I have come by when I was writing this paper, I'd like to present to you because I think it's interesting looking at those aspects of federation and then trying to compare them to what the European Union does or what the European Union might do. So, first feature of confederations is that they very often eventually turn into central states. So you have a lot of confederations in European history that started off as just being federations of different entities that came together, but then they eventually turned into central states. And what were the driving forces behind this centralization? Now, in the 17th and 18th century, it was, of course, absolutism. So this idea of one king being in charge of everything, centralizing stuff, which came mainly from France, but not only from France, also in countries like Germany, we had absolute tendencies. And then in the 19th and 20th century, the ideas of nationalism and of imperialism led to a huge trend towards centralization and getting rid of any federal structures they might have had. And of course, there's another threat for those confederations, and that threat is in the idea of constructivism, the idea of that there is one entity, a person, or a collective that actually knows how things should work, and they get like rid of all those bothering differences to finally forge the one central power, and also the argument of efficiency. Efficiency is always an argument that is used in favor of centralization. Things are just more efficient if we do it centrally instead of everybody doing their own sort of thing. And that's, I think, one of the biggest dangers in a very dangerous argument if you want to get rid of the competition of the small units. Second finding, the balance of power is crucial for a functioning confederation. Once that balance of power is really disturbed, so once one part of the confederation gets the upper hand, the whole concept is jeopardized. And the price of that can be internal conflicts up to civil war. We have many examples of that, starting with the Athenian League in the 5th century, 4th century before Christ, where Athens just got rid of all these small Greek towns eventually, up to like the 30 Years' War, where Bohemia was, Austria tried to turn over Bohemia. You have the same experience in Switzerland, where you had civil wars because the Protestant part was getting too strong as opposed to the Catholic part. You had that in Germany with Prussia and Austria in the 19th century, and of course in the USA with the big civil war in the 1860s, where also one part of the country was getting the upper hand and the other part didn't want to bow in. So the balance of power in confederations, how is it eliminated? Or which are the steps that might lead to elimination of balance of power? And I think that's very interesting, especially if you look into the tendencies you might find today in the European Union. So one tool of eliminating the balance of power is by harmonizing legal systems. That happens very often. So you don't have any more the competition of different legal systems, but in the name of efficiency or whatever, somebody tries to harmonize those legal systems. Uniting military is often also a threat to the balance of power in confederations. Of course, bureaucracy and the growth of bureaucracy, because bureaucracies, especially if they are seated at the central power or the combining power, then they tend to extend their powers, their competences endlessly. And also the harmonization of the monetary system. That's something that's often used to centralize federations. And finally, the common fiscal policy, so that, I mean, for example, in the Roman Empire of, like the Second Roman Empire, the German Roman Empire, one huge attempt was made in the 15th, 16th century to centralize the empire, and one of the main points of this attempt was that finally the emperor was supposed to get his own tax income, his own tax revenue. You might have heard that in more recent times, this argument too. Now, the third finding, generally, a confederate constitution supports personal freedom because you have the competition of different entities which open up spaces for the citizens. Like, for example, in the German states before 1800, you had all those small states forming the Roman Empire, and you had a state like Weimar, for example, which is really tiny. It had 100,000 inhabitants in those days, but it was the cultural center of all of Germany in the late 1700s, because it had a very tolerant policy, and many of the poets and the artists and whatever, they just moved to Weimar, and so they transformed Weimar in a culturally extremely successful mini-state. You also can experience that in Italy, if you look into the Italian history in the Renaissance, like those different towns, Florence and Siena and Genova and Venezia and all those towns, they evolved also through the competition that was going on between those small units, and this competition was beneficial mainly also for the citizens. So cities became free spaces because they competed for other citizens to move to their town. It doesn't always work that way, though, one must admit. So, for example, in Switzerland, personal freedom was, up to the 20th century, not something really relevant in the small Swiss cantons. You had a small oligarchy who were usually ruling over those citizens there. Next finding, confederations benefit from small groups with economic power and self-confidence. For example, the urban bourgeois societies in the Hanseatic city in the Netherlands, and the powerful nobility in Poland, Lithuania, and also Germany. And these small groups with economic power and self-confidence, they help to keep up the autonomy of the member states. So if you have a really awareness of yourself, confidence of yourself, then you want to protect your free spaces, your free rooms, and that really helps to keep confederations functioning. Also, confederations tend to have more efficient economies because the central power has fewer access to the citizens' money, and you have competition for the best merchants and craftsmen, at least in those days. I mean, nowadays competition is sort of changed because you don't have that many craftsmen anymore, but you have the competition for the smartest heads. Next finding, confederations were generally more peaceful. So in the time between the 13th and 18th century, you had a huge amount of wars that had been fought in Europe. But mostly confederations were less belligerent than central states. So if you compare the track record, the military track record, for example, of France, Spain, England, classical centralized countries, to the track record of the Roman Empire, of the Netherlands, of Poland, Lithuania, it's quite clear that the latter were much more peaceful and rarely attacked any other country. That has to do with the fact that in a confederation it was much more difficult to raise an army. You had to ask the people who were ruling the different countries, towns, for soldiers. That was a big and not very effective endeavor. And it was also difficult to raise the necessary funds, because mostly you didn't have a common fiscal policy. But also because confederations were mostly economically stronger than central states by their own accord. So you had the more economically diversified and trade-oriented confederations. And if they would have gone to war, this specialization, this trade would have been much more endangered. It would have been threatened by the war. They would have lost trade connections and so on. So they abstained much more from wars. And also, if you wanted to become prosperous economically, war, at least from the point of confederations, wasn't the best way. But actually, war was tapping your resources and was destroying things you could utilize much better in a different way of trading. And finally, the last finding, often homogeneity benefits confederations. So having a common language, a common tradition, mentality is often something that helps to get people to stick together. But there are also prominent and long-living examples of very heterogeneous confederations that work pretty well. For example, Poland and Lithuania, I think that's one of the most beautiful examples for that. But also, in a way, Switzerland and the US are also working with a big heterogeneity inside their confederation. So to sum it up, confederations have always been threatened. They have been threatened through mighty neighbors, the call for a central state, for efficiency, and through internal conflicts and the thirst for power. I've chosen this, I think, a quite interesting picture to illustrate the danger of centralization. Because here you can, it's from the early 20th century, you can see like the Eastern danger. It's a sort of a Buddha statue there that is threatening the Western Christian world, which is has the light of the cross, and you have all the, like, there's Britain and there's Germany and like all the France, all those countries represented. That is a classical way how federations are threatened and are transformed into central states by warning of the big power abroad. So we have to stick together now. We cannot afford anymore all those differences. We have to unite in order to withstand the danger from the East, for example. It's a very classical argument. And by these arguments of the danger, of efficiency, of sticking together, you can actually get rid of a lot of federal elements and centralize the political entities. Now, this would be my counterexample. We don't have a very good living tradition of federations at the moment. I mean, the United States, at least from the beginning of the 20th century, have been getting rid of a lot of elements of federation in their own state. Also in other countries inside Europe, the federal idea isn't on the raise, but it's rather a lot about centralizing. But if we look back into history, we must acknowledge that these decentralized units, like, for example, Lübeck, which was the central, the main city of the Hanseatic League, where sort of the heart of the Hanseatic League, you can see all those people running around trading and bartering and trying to improve their lives. The track record of those confederations is beautiful and should be a role model, I think, much more, for example, for the European Union. They have been providing an unprecedented degree of wealth, of peace, of liberty on European soil. They have guaranteed against tyranny and have helped to promote free markets, democracy, division of power, the rule of law, political liberty. I mean, most of those ideas have actually been born in those states which were more federate, which didn't have a central power, but actually gave room for competition, for ideas, for cooperation. Now, finally, let's move on to the European Union. As I said before, Trevor, you weren't there yet, but I'm actually not defending Jean-Claude Juncker's European Union, alas. But I think that the general concepts might provide us with a framework that, if properly reformed, can be extremely beneficial. Now, what can we learn from those philosophical questions, from those historical questions for the future of the European Union? My first claim would be the DNA of Europe and the reason for its success were its small units, were the cities of Flanders or of northern Germany, the cities of Italy, the small states of the German Empire, the Swiss cantons. I mean, all those small units, people who had the possibility to do something in their small circle without some central power trying to tell them where to go and what to do. That is the success story. The big division of Europe is the success of Europe. And my conclusion would be that we must not only avoid a European central state from coming into reality, but we must also apply this principle of subsidiarity of the small units to the nation states. I'd say it doesn't really make sense to take back power, take back control from Brussels and bestow this power and control onto London, Paris, or Berlin. That doesn't make sense. And if you actually look into what is happening right now in Great Britain, the Conservative Party, the allegedly conservative or allegedly liberal party, is promoting a huge welfare state, is promoting a huge state, a huge surveillance state, and so on. That will not liberate Britain. And the same goes for other tendencies of anti-EU arguments that use the terms of liberty and freedom. But if you look into Poland, if you look into Hungary, the people who are there are advocating for more distance from the EU. And maybe this is the European Union where we could move to eventually. I think we have an ideal size of these autonomous units. You could find it, for example, in Slovenia or Lithuania or Finland. They all have between 2 and 6 million people, or regions of a comparable size. Like, for example, Catalonia, the Spanish part, which is trying to become independent, it's about the size, the population size of Bulgaria. Or Lombardy, the north of Italy, is about the population size of Sweden. Or I checked that before I came here, South Romania, so the southern part of Romania, is about as big as the Czech Republic. So those would be units where I think a lot of authority could be bestowed on. So in this vision, you wouldn't have 28 or 27 states anymore in the European Union. You would sort of have 60 to 80 small states, small units. Now, what is the good thing about those small units? The units that possess more power should be the units where people have a general understanding of what other people think, where they broadly share one cultural background. So, I mean, if you take a country like Germany, I'm sorry if I have to refer to my home country in this regard, but you know, you have people that are so hugely diverse. I have no idea why you put them into one country. They don't actually, people in the north of Germany, they don't understand people in the south of Germany. And it doesn't make sense that people with a cultural background of Prussia, of Protestantism, should have same policy, same regulation as people in the south with a Bavarian Catholic background. It's completely different. It's culturally so diverse, and that is a strength of Europe, this cultural diversity. And we should cherish that. We should try to bring back the authority to those regions where people actually have a general understanding of how people think, where they share values, share a worldview. Another advantage of those small units is that you can assign responsibilities properly. You can match consequences to decisions. So the bigger a unit is, the more difficult it becomes to actually say, well, the decision you made there had this consequence. In the small unit, it's quite easy. If you say, well, we have to build, I don't know, rebuild our roads, and for that we're going to tax like 2% more income tax for the next 10 years. Then this is a decision which has clearly accessible consequences. In huge units, it's just a big mess. You know, somebody pays some taxes somewhere, and some taxes are spent for other things, in another place, but nobody has any control anymore of what people are actually doing. That's, for example, the big advantage of the Swiss cantons, where actually citizens decide on, well, I don't know, we're going to build a new swimming pool for our city, and that means we have to invest that much money for that. So it's really important to have this accountability, this responsibility, also because you can control politicians much better. You can put pressure on them. The next advantage of small units, and that's what the history of federation tells us, is that you can facilitate trial and error processes, and you can provide for best practice examples. So you have those small units that just try to solve a problem this way, and then other units can say, well, that's the best way we've encountered to now. We're just going to take this solution for ourselves too. You have a competition over the best solution, and everybody can adapt solutions more individually. Now, of course, it is crucial, as I mentioned before, that those units are authorized to pursue their own fiscal policy. I mean, that's the worst thing to destroy a federation, if you have much fiscal competence at the central power. It's already bad with the nation states, and it would be even worse with a Central European Union assuming fiscal power. And also, as far as it's possible, I think you should have a high degree of legislative autonomy. As long, and that's the important thing, as the four freedoms, the four fundamental freedoms are not infringed. So freedom of capital, of movement, of services, and what's the fifth one? Of, I remember. Yeah, so the common market basically is not to be infringed. So if you have, of course, legislative authority that sort of limits the common market, that should not be allowed. But anything else, I see a big possibility of just letting people try and solve problems. Now, what about the EU? I mean, I'm making the case for the European Union. So what is the role of this European Union in this ideal world of mine? I think it is really important to distribute power. One of the main features of liberty is that power is distributed and not centralized. And I think that the European Union can be a very good tool to have an additional layer of power distribution. And it has proven to be sometimes corrective for the nation states. And the more levels of power you have, the more freedom you have. I'm quite sure about that. You can just spread power, don't centralize it. So the European Union can just be an additional level of power. And in my vision, it would be the overarching bond, which is in charge of two major tasks: being custodians and being diplomats. So as custodians, the European Union would be in charge of controlling that the four fundamental freedoms are observed. Now, they actually look into the legislation of the small units, they check all the treaties they are making with each other in order to always preserve the fundamental freedoms of the common market. And as diplomats, they can facilitate for deals between those regions, between those smaller units. Because, of course, cooperation, as I pointed out at the beginning of this lecture, cooperation is a fundamental way towards more freedom, towards more prosperity. Cooperation is good. Sovereignty, take back control, can be a danger. But cooperation, opening up, taking the market way instead of the politics way, that is what the European miracle actually entails. So you want a lot of cooperation going on between these small units, and this is a part where the European Union can play a role. It can make sense also if you have a huge degree of authority and autonomy in those small regions to cooperate in a lot of issues. You could have like voluntary corporations, which we have nowadays already. So take the euro, for example. Not everybody is part of the euro. You have the Schengen, so the free traveling treaty, and also that is not something that every European country has implemented. So it's not like we don't have that already in the European Union, those opt-in, opt-out possibilities. So you can have decisions where people say we cooperate, but not everybody has to play in the game. Let me give you some examples. You could imagine that countries or regions like Lombardy, northern Italy, Tyrol, the part of Austria and Bavaria, that they decide to have a common social security system. Because they're economically quite similar, they're all more or less wealthy regions, they could say we pool together and have a social security system which we combine. You could imagine that Flanders, South Netherlands, and the Rhineland, the northern part of Belgium, the southern part of the Netherlands, and the area around the Rhine, that they combine for a common traffic police, because that area is heavily, through infrastructure, heavily combined with traffic and roads and stuff. Why shouldn't they have a common traffic police, which isn't the same as in the rest of Germany or Belgium, for example? You could also think of the Aquitaine, that's this French region, and the Basque country in Spain. They could just pool together and have a common education system, because they have a lot of cultural similarities, and the Aquitaine and the Basque are both quite far away from the central powers in Paris and Madrid. They could just join for a common school system. You could also think of regions all over Europe who are not geographically related, harmonizing their administrative law. You could say, well, the administrative law, let's say in Estonia, is especially efficient, so Catalonia and southern Romania and Ireland say, well, we adapt the Estonian administrative law system because it just works much better. So they have a common law system. Of course, there might be some areas of cooperation where it makes sense to cooperate at a really big level, and where maybe everybody should try to cooperate, where you could have this Hanseatic system of finding a solution for everybody with the possibility to opt out. I'm just think of defense. I mean, it would of course make sense to have a bigger area to join together in defense policy, or also very much topical at the moment, the environmental questions. They cannot, of course, be solved by single regions. They have to be solved in big units, and it might be better to come together in a as big as possible context, as long as it is voluntary. So the European Union could play a pivotal role, a key role in this model of mine, not as a center of power, but as a guardian and umpire that removes barriers and borders, because that has been the problem, especially of the 18th, 19th, 20th century, that we put up all these borders. That cooperation has been destroyed often in the name of things like the nation state, for example, or ideas like the nation state. So the European Union could remove those barriers and borders, and it has done that already. It's an additional balance of power, and it can be a safeguard. It can be a safeguard against concentration of power. Doesn't have to be, can be the tool of concentration of power, but it also can be the safeguard against it if you properly draw up those institutions. Such a Europe of small units would correspond to the tradition that made Europe successful, strong, stable, and peaceful. It would befit a union of peoples who are bound by their appreciation of free markets, democracy, self-responsibility, and open and tolerant society. Or to put it in the words of Friedrich August von Hayek in The Road to Serfdom, where he wrote, neither an omnipotent superstate, so not like the Brussels monster, nor a loose association of free nations, like Brexit Britain and Orban's Hungary and Polish peace and whatever, but a community of nations of free men must be our goal. That is exactly where we should aim, I think, with the European Union, to facilitate individual freedom. And I'm at least convinced that the European Union could, if we take the right paths, contribute to being exactly that, and to finally get rid of that concentration of power you have in those supposedly, he puts it into quotation marks, that supposedly free nations. Because believe me, when you take back control in Britain or in Warsaw or wherever, it's not going to be a liberal state.